Back to King and Cubby. Right. And then we wind now.
Set to open the house.
5 minutes to air.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is Saturday night at 8.
Worked too hard, you ate too much. The cheesecake made you greedy. Let your aching head and stomach hear this message from old Speedy.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, WMAR-TV has the honor to bring before its news microphone.
And I look for you in a magic mirror. Romper, bumper, stomper, boo.
Gunther Brewing Company, Baltimore.
Jackie Gleason. The Honeymooners.
I want you all to smile prettily. We're being televised this morning. Very first time that the Breakfast Club show has been televised in the morning.
Hi, everybody. This is Jim McManus.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Chock full of nuts is that heavenly coffee.
That's why you can trust your car to the man who wears the star.
The Philco television cameras are trained upon us, and we're on Philadelphia, Dumont, New York, Baltimore, and Washington.
When television descended on Maryland, it came first from a tower on a skyscraper in downtown Baltimore. It happened on an autumn day 50 years ago, and hardly anyone was watching.
50 years ago, only a few hundred people in Baltimore had television sets. Cabinets like these with odd little windows through which it was rumored live human beings could be seen and be heard. For the longest time in the fall of 1947, people near television sets, mostly in taverns and department stores, saw only this.
The WMAR-TV test pattern dominated programming as daring men scrambled to connect the cables and push all the right buttons to make TV come alive and stay alive in Maryland. It seems quaint now. People gathered about a TV to watch a test pattern. Filmmaker Barry Levinson even acknowledged the peculiarity of it in Avalon, his homage to the Baltimore of his boyhood, and his commentary on how TV changed all that.
So what is this? Television.
And that's how the television revolution started. That's all there really was to it until one October afternoon in 1947. A Baltimore Evening Sun reporter named Jim McManus, assigned to work for the new television station his newspaper company owned, went to Pimlico Racecourse in a remote telecast truck with a sports writer named Joe Kelly, 2 camera operators, a director, and support engineers. And on that afternoon, Baltimore had its first live telecast of a horse race. Its first live telecast of anything that moved.
First thing I remember was that we did 2 races from Pimlico, but the track would not let us do the feature race because they were afraid it might hurt the gate. There were probably 200 sets in the whole city.
One of the camera operators that day at Pimlico was a man named Ed Mick.
Just before we got on the air, the other camera died. I had the camera that was functioning in number 1, and I did that whole program on 1 camera without a lens change because we had a crazy director by the name of Paul Knight, who they had brought down from New York. Paul would not allow me to change lenses on the air. He said, "That's forbidden, you can't do that." So I shot that whole damn thing. 2 races, plus a fashion show in between on a 17-inch telephoto lens that was only 30 feet from the people.
I probably said, good afternoon, I'm Jim McManus, reporting from Pimlico, something like that. I don't know what else I might have said, and I would have introduced Joe Kelly, who will be our analyst this afternoon. We also had Dave Woods, who was the publicist for the racetrack. He was on for an interview with us. I don't remember anything about the races themselves.
But McKay would always remember the first review of his work as a television reporter, the one that came from the legendary sage of Baltimore, Sun columnist H.L. Mencken.
After watching it, said I wouldn't give a dime for an hour of that stuff, even if it included a massacre. And he said, the young man doing the commentary, a young man from the sports department, was very bad at the job, and there were long periods of silence. I think that's the last time I ever left silence on the air.
Ed Mick recalls that, all things considered, that first broadcast wasn't so bad, at least from his vantage, behind the camera with the telephoto lens.
I think I did pretty damn well because I was right pleased with the fact that I managed to keep horses in the picture all the way around. and I thought we did pretty good.
That wasn't the end of Channel 2's inaugural day. Ed Mick and his co-workers broke down their cameras and equipment at Pimlico and raced to the Baltimore Coliseum, where they broadcast an evening basketball game. They'd never done a remote telecast before, but somehow they managed 2 in one day. As Ed Mick recalls, his boss, Bob Cochran, left little time for celebrating.
He told me what the next assignment was, which was 6 o'clock the next morning, and it was a remote from somewhere, and I don't even remember where now. But we never did stop. It went around the clock.
The real beginning of it, to me personally, was one day I was standing in an equipment room way up in the tower of the old then O'Sullivan building with Neil H. Swanson, who was the executive editor of the Sun papers. Always had a cigarette hanging from his lower lip. You know, wondered how it stayed there. And of course had the galluses and the tie pulled down. Really old-time newspaper man. And he and I are standing there because they're trying to bring in a picture from the Coliseum, which was kind of a dumpy old sports arena we had then, because the second show after our horse racing in the afternoon is going to be a basketball game at night. It was about 2 days before that. And all we see is snow, you know, nothing on this screen. And slowly this picture came in of people roller skating. That's what happened there in the daytime. They're roller skating, and he clapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Well, Jim, it looks like we've bought ourselves a television station." I thought, I make $65 a week, Mr. Swanson. I don't know about you.
The Sun paper's WMAR venture into television symbolized the daring and entrepreneurship of post-World War American culture. Men and women had come home from war, anxious to get on with life, anxious for the next adventure. And television offered a million challenges. In fact, that's how many parts there were in the station's first transmitter. We'll meet more of the people who got this station on the air and kept it there when we come back. WMAR-TV's first logo, not its test pattern, its first fancy logo. Once the station got on the air in 1947, the challenge was to stay on the air in 1948 and beyond with something more than a fancy logo to look at.
Most of the station's first telecasts in 1947 and 1948 were remote telecasts. The men who brought television to Baltimore were inventing programs literally on the run.
In those first few years on the air, we didn't even have a studio. We were working with the first one, and then we got a second mobile unit going. So we had 2 mobile units to go. So we were able to flip-flop from one to the other. So we would do a program, and we'd strike, and we'd go to the next setup. And it was a case of doing that. And my wife said, she said, I don't know why you didn't kill yourself in those first few weeks you were on the air, because it was just constant.
It was faster and more expeditious to build 2 mobile units and run them around town.
George Crone came to WMAR from a radio engineering job in 1948.
I can remember one specific Tuesday where we did 9 remotes in one day. We leapfrogged each other. We opened up a supermarket over in Glen Burnie and wound up, after the wrestling, over at the Hillbilly nightclub in South Baltimore. And we did 9 remotes. We were big on opening stores and supermarkets.
I wasn't too happy when I was assigned to do pro wrestling at the old Coliseum, because I knew, you know, basically it's fake, and I didn't want to lie. So I did it, I guess, for a year, and I never lied. I never called it blood, because I knew it was a blood capsule thing they did. And, you know, I didn't say this is a fake, but I just did not lie. And some of the wrestlers got mad at me, particularly a guy named Billy Graham. I remember no relation to the minister. And one night he was wrestling a guy called the Super Swedish Angel, who was a kindly old grandfather, really, weighed 350 pounds. And at one point during this thing, Billy Graham picked up the Super Swedish Angel and, you know, turned him around his head the way they do and threw him at me and said, "There, is that fake, kid?"
Television was so new, no one understood what it should be. Radio with pictures was one description, but you get the impression from talking with its earliest pioneers that no one was sure what it would become. They were too busy creating, on instinct, programs that might draw viewers. In the first year of its life, WMAR could only offer a few hours of programming a day.
We were on the CBS network, and the network started at 8 o'clock in the evening. A little bit later on, they start at 6 o'clock with a puppet show. But they usually, in the early days, they started at 8 o'clock. And for example, I remember, I think it was Wednesday night at 8 o'clock, prime time on CBS, was Mrs. Dione Lucas's cooking show, Cordon Bleu. You know, and of course the network was Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. That was it.
I want you all to smile prettily. We're being televised this morning. Very first time that the Breakfast Club show has been televised in the morning. That's it? Don't overdo it now. The Philco television cameras are trained upon us, and we're on Philadelphia, Dumont, New York, Baltimore, and Washington. Sorry you folks all over the country can't see it, but someday you will. The whole works, I'm sure.
When we first went on the air, we started playing records and transmitting only the test pattern. And that was great until the FCC forbade us to do it anymore. They said, you can't put that test pattern on with just music. You gotta have something else. So then we had to create some more programming. Everything was inventive in those days. Everything you did was new and different.
To be in television at that time was sort of like, you know, being a writer at the invention of the printing press.
It was terribly exciting, yeah. And I'll tell you, no matter where you went, you were an object of attraction because people would stop us in the street when they'd see the mobile unit and they'd say, hey, can I look inside?
The biggest show we had done was sometime during the first year, I think. But we had been on the air for a few months, but they said, we're going to do the opening of the new airport, Friendship International Airport. I think the word international was more hope than reality. And it was named after the little town that was obliterated to make room for the airport. But they said, we're going to have this, and President Truman is coming, and he's going to give a major address. He's flying in, and we're going to have grandstands for 25,000 people right out on the runway. So they sold commercials to Marty's restaurant, Marty Welsh, for, I believe it was it was about 4 or 5 hours of commercials. Instead of 250,000 people, there were 2,500 people. You know, Truman flew in, took one look at this sparse crowd, you know, had a few remarks and no major address, flew out of there. We were on the air at 9 o'clock in the morning, by 10:15, it's done. But we have to fill until 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon because we have the commercials.
Jim McKay learned by doing. He was one of several men literally thrown into television when it was still a strange new world.
Some of the first men hired were engineers who had designed stuff during World War II for Bendix Freeze. Some were advanced amateurs who knew quite a bit, and they came over and experimented. Everything we did was an experiment because there were no books, no rules.
After we were on the air for a few months, Bob Cochran, who was program director, said, this is really boring in the afternoon. All we do is put up the Indian head and play music. He said, why don't we stick a camera out the window, lock it in place, and if anybody wants to watch, they can watch whatever's going on at Baltimore and Charles Street. So he stuck this camera. And after a week or two, one afternoon, 2 hold-up men came running out of, I think it was the Hub department store, you know, looking this way, the things across their face, and the cops chased them up the street. But if you didn't see it live, you didn't see it because there was no videotape at that time.
That hold-up story made the Sun the next day. It was news. At some point, as Channel 2's audience started to grow and demand more programming, and as the other TV stations got on the air in Baltimore, a decision was made to put news cameras in the streets, putting Baltimore on film. When we come back, we'll see what life looked like here 50 years ago. Baltimore Flower Mart, spring 1949. A Channel 2 newsman with a 16mm film camera recorded the scene at Mount Vernon Place. And if your family had a TV set, these are the images that came through it that evening. They have not been seen by a television audience since. Same with these images of Byrd Stadium under construction at the University of Maryland, College Park. The mayor of Baltimore had been injured in a car crash. A newsman from Channel 2 was allowed into the mayor's room to record his recovery. Within a year, Channel 2 had its own news program, though only for about 15 minutes a day for starters. It was a local version of the old newsreels people were used to seeing when they went out to the movies.
Well, the news was done almost live in the sense that it was shot at anywhere in the morning up until around 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was brought in and high-speed processed. This was 16-millimeter film. It was edited, rehearsed, and then put on the air at 6 o'clock, 5, 6 o'clock, depending on which news it was. The hard news was done as news. The soft news, or what I would call the informational around the town, was Our Town, which was a separate news show which followed the hard news.
It's interesting to note what made news in 1948, just a year after WMAR got on the air. A deer struck by a car made news. So did the police department's tests for new chauffeurs. Here's Howard Street being prepared for the holiday season. Here's a 6-alarm fire hitting the old Bay Line pier. Though the city still had 3 thriving daily newspapers, these images on television screens were a powerful draw. And soon, more and more Baltimoreans slowly began to turn on their television sets for news.
To tell you the truth, we had a hard time filling hard news because it wasn't as blatant as it is now. Now we can put an hour of hard news on that people will be disgusted with. And you have to remember, before television, you had little enclaves, Little Italy, the Polish enclave, the German enclaves, all these little sections who, for all intents and purposes, didn't know the other part existed. Nobody in East Baltimore would even contemplate Roland Park. After television came on and we got to show everybody in town, different sections of the town, it started to congeal into a big city then. Before that, it was a bunch of little cities inside of a big city.
People started buying more and more TV sets, curious about what could come out of the wooden box with the strange window. June Thorne, who would later work for WMAR as the host of her own show, remembers the first time she saw this thing called television.
If I remember correctly, it was on Utah Street, probably, in one of the department store windows. And there were these images, and a crowd had gathered. Well, I got in the crowd, and I watched my first television program standing outside on the sidewalk.
It really caught on quickly in Baltimore, television. And the thing that comes most quickly to mind was this cultural phenomenon, where if anybody on the block had a television set, the neighbors felt quite welcome just to go over and knock on the door and say, you know, may I watch the wrestling with you tonight, or whatever it might be, or roller derby. They were the 2 big sports. And it was strange, and the people who had to say, felt like they had to have beer and pretzels for the guests coming in, but they never thought of saying, no, you can't come in.
What it did was, it, at the beginning, kept people home for a while. I mean, there were certain nights you didn't go out. When Milton Berle was on, nobody went out. I mean, everybody had a TV set, and of course you made friends. If you had a TV set and your neighbors didn't, you were their friend.
Something else started to happen in the early 1950s. WMAR put more and more programming of its own on the air, and the station developed personalities who would become famous throughout the region.
One of the very first programs we put on the air from the studio was the National Review with Bailey Ross.
We got a wonderful show planned for you. Everybody, even the cameramen today are alive.
Do the huckabut, do the huckabut. If you don't know how to do it, why you're out of luck.
And we did that for 3 hours every afternoon, 6 days a week. And that was our big selling point, because everybody watched that.
We had several singers and dancers, and they were each asked the first week to prepare 3 numbers a day. Well, I think the second day, there wasn't much going on, and they ran out of their numbers by about 5:30. We were on 3 to 6. So I got up and sang a song. So from then on, I sang a song every day and loved every minute of it. Still like to sing. We would have interviews with celebrities coming in to perform at the Hippodrome Theater in those days. We might have Milton Berle, might have anybody. They had all the big bands coming in. And the old, always in the theater on Pennsylvania Avenue, where you would, the Royal, sure, where Lionel Hampton came up and he played the vibes for us for a half an hour one day.
The first time I performed on television, before I was hired by Channel 2, was on Channel 2 in their first studio down on Charles Street as a dancer. I was with a dance troupe, a modern dance troupe led by Vera Cole out of the YWCA. And I danced on television.
The Collegians were a motley assortment of kids, all of whom were being pushed by their parents for one reason or another to do this stuff and to get on television, to get on the air, to become famous or something, whatever they were looking for.
We'll be with you 30 minutes again. We're going to start off with Rodney, boxing, lots of living to be due. Take a look.
T. Oliver Hughes kept them going, and he had the lumber yard and was able to sustain it and pay for the expenses of what they had. So that was where it came from. That was a dream.
You have to remember one thing with T. Oliver Hughes' Collegians. He kept a lot of kids off the streets and into a club and into a somewhat meaningful way of looking at life. It was a togetherness show. We had other shows like that. We had National Beer sponsored an amateur show on Saturday night, and it was from the Center Theater. And it was 6 acts of fairly decent amateur. We did one of the first cooking shows from the Gas and Electric Company. They sponsored a half-hour cooking show in which we had to devise how to do that because our cameras were semi-fixed, they were heavy. They weighed, well, the one behind me weighs approximately 90 pounds. You don't lug that around your shoulder. So we devised the overhead mirror shot, and we were one of the first ones to use that.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, WMAR-TV has the honor to bring before its news microphone Mr. Roy Estep, one of Maryland's old and famous jockeys.
A man named Dave Stickle had established himself as the station's news director and held that post for several years, well into the 1960s, when George Collins joined the station as a reporter.
The dominance of Channel 2 News can be traced to the fact that Dave Stickle did such a well of a job. By today's standards, he was not necessarily the dynamic, good-looking newsman, but he was one heck of a journalist, came up from the Sun. And when George Rogers became chief anchorman here, he inherited a station that was #1, primarily because of the work of Dave Stickle.
Ann Marr and Sylvia Scott became the first women on the air on a regular basis. Helen Bentley, a Sun reporter and later a member of Congress, established herself as an authority on the sprawling Port of Baltimore and had her own show on the subject. Chuck Richards was the first African-American man hired by the station as an announcer. But the station's best-known announcer was Stu Kerr, a man who would put an indelible face on Channel 2 for 2 generations of viewers.
One of the most multi-talented, gentle people I've ever known. I guess to really evaluate the kind of person Stu was, you would look at how kids loved him, whether he was Bozo the Clown or just Stu Kerr. They loved him.
Memories of Professor Cool when we come back. Back when the programming on Channel 2 was still a make-it-up-as-you-go adventure, the station was lucky to have a man named Stu Kerr show up at the front door of the old Sun building at 2 West Redwood Street, right near Baltimore Street, one day in 1952. Ed Mick gave Stu Kerr his audition.
Stu wanted to try out for television, and he read the announcements, and he did everything fine. His voice was excellent and all that sort of thing. And I said to Bob Cochran, I think he's a winner. Let's try him. Bob said, fine, let's go with him. And, of course, Then Stu started creating his own images, and the next thing you know, he had the janitor on the air, and he was a huge success with that stuff.
The janitor was a mop-in-hand character who showed up on the air at sign-off time. Later, the bit switched to mornings and became known as the early riser. It showed Stu Kerr's improvisational talents. Over the years, Stu Kerr became Baltimore's Bozo the Clown and the Captain Gown Professor Cool. He was a weatherman when he had to be. He made thousands of public appearances during his career. He embodied what early television was all about, inventing a way to entertain and inform people long before syndicated and network television programming came to dominate the offerings of affiliate TV stations. Kevin Clash, the voice of the famous Muppet Elmo, started his career working with Stu Kerr in Baltimore television.
He always said to me, as far as performing, as far as for children anyway, 95% of it should be entertainment and 5% of it should be education, and they'll get what they need. And he was right about that. He was the one who everybody knew, and said he was Mr. Channel 2, and they're still saying that when he's long gone. I mean, he was the most. What you saw on screen when he would bring in, a potato, as when he was weatherman on Channel 2, as a potato with a nose, and it looked like it had a nose and eyes and everything, and he would laugh at it and think it was the funniest thing. I mean, that's what he was off camera. I mean, he found the most minuscule stuff to laugh at, and I remember going to one of the Channel 2 holiday parties, and he had everybody up and dancing, and they were dancing this new dance that he came up with, and it was the most, I mean, I wouldn't do it, but he had everybody up doing it, and it was the funnest thing. I mean, he reeked happiness and silliness, and that's what he was all about. And he was a very, very, talented, especially the people that I've worked with over the years. So many celebrities and so many. Stu is still, way beyond the people that I've worked with. But I've seen him give his heart and his time and his soul to a lot of different people that I met over the years around him. And very, very generous, very, 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 very generous. And he always said, and people always said, Stu, you're too much of a nice guy. And he showed me how to respect people and do my craft as professionally as I can.
One of the station's big early successes was Dialing for Dollars, a midday contest with a simple challenge. Viewers had to be watching Channel 2 at the right time, know the amount being offered as a prize. Should the man on the television happen to call your house, you'd be a winner. Stu Kerr was its longtime host. Once upon a time, it had the largest viewership of any few minutes of television programming in Baltimore. People watched. People waited for the phone to ring.
They were waiting to get that call because there were a couple of $1,000 riding on that call. And these gals, they were hungry for money in those days, and they did. But it was fun, and it was exciting, and it kept us all on the edge of our seats.
By the time Dialing for Dollars went off the air after a long run well into the 1970s, it had given away nearly $1 million to Marylanders who just happened to know the count and the amount and who just happened to be watching Channel 2. Whether it was Dialing for Dollars or the early riser, Stu Kerr put the most human of all faces on Channel 2 and helped the station make a strong and early personal connection to its viewers.
When we return, from the 40s into the 50s and the Golden Age.
This is where television in Baltimore began, Pimlico Racecourse. It was here on October 30th, 1947, that WMAR went first on the air with a live telecast of 2 horse races and a rooftop fashion show in between. Though futurists had predicted it, no one working for WMAR that day could have imagined that television would become a global power, touching just about every culture on Earth, impacting every aspect of modern life.
Ralph?
What do you want now?
How many eggs do you
Those of us who grew up in a TV-saturated world have a hard time imagining what life was like without it. And some of the earliest images of television, what passed for programming, amuse us. They seem corny or quaint now, but they were probably reflective of their times and reflective of television's growing pains during the scramble to find form and purpose. Jack Dawson was an early Channel 2 announcer, later sports anchor.
It was interesting because no 2 days were alike, and I don't like routine a whole lot. So because no 2 days were alike, I sort of liked that part of it. You know, there were 5 or 6 guys at just 3 stations. You know, 5 or 6 guys here, 5 or 6 guys at BAL, 5 or 6 guys at WJZ, and those were the people everyone knew. And everywhere you went, you know, people would talk to you about the last thing you'd done, and either they liked it or they didn't like it, and they'd tell you. But it was a little awesome to realize that you know, almost everybody out there on the street, when you'd walk by, would know who you are. It's awesome to me. I've been retired now 5.5 years, and people still will stop and say, "You're," and I say, "Yes, I am," and they remember fondly, and I think that's terrific. We were bringing them the information at the time when this medium was becoming the greatest source of that information for the average Joe who came home from work a day and sat down in front of his television set.
Interest in television escalated rapidly in Baltimore. Several months after WMAR got on the air, 2 other stations got their signals out, and within just a few years, the competition for viewers and advertising dollars was fierce.
I'm the man who comes around with golden Guernsey milk. It's good for all the family because of lots of energy.
It's a bright beer, a light beer, American's the right beer. The Diamond label's your best friend.
We knew that BAL was coming on the air, and then another one came on, which was called WAM in those days, WAAM, which later became WJZ. And that was kind of the little old third station. That was Dumont at that time. BAL, of course, was the main competitor right from the beginning, but WAM did put on a show just like our sports parade, competing with us, with Nick Campafrito, who was an old football player and you know, a radio sports commentator. But the competition was pretty fierce right from the first.
In 1947, there were 170,000 television sets in the country. By the end of 1948, 250,000. 1948 is considered a benchmark year by historians. It was the year commercial television really took off. It was a big rollout year for the networks. CBS stole NBC radio stars Jack Benny and Red Skelton to compete with Mr. Television Milton Berle.
Now you realize we mustn't be trite. Sure, to get the work right, it's got to be bright.
CBS also signed the big man, Jackie Gleason.
Yeah, plain just a cup of donuts.
Another show went on the air in 1948, the Broadway newspaper columnist Ed Sullivan's variety show, which became, to the surprise of many, a huge CBS hit. Ed Sullivan produced his television show for 23 years. Into that male-dominated world of early CBS stepped Lucille Ball, whose situation comedy still stands as one of the most popular of all time.
I love Lucy and she loves me. We're as happy as two can be.
All of this programming from New York, from entertainment to news, filtered into Maryland from WMAR-TV. It remained a CBS affiliate until 1981. Bob Cochran was a Channel 2 programming executive for many of those years.
Television took off like a running steed. We found many things of great interest to put on the air. Our business department found advertisers to sustain various interesting programs, and those little spots that we call commercials.
Lovely. but I meant draw one bow. No. Bow. Bow. In a glass. Look, all I want is a glass of beer with a nice head. That's it, Mr. Bow.
Everybody was surprised, including, thank goodness, the people at WMAR-TV, at the speed with which the medium grew, both local and national. We became the 6th station to join the CBS television network. And of course that made my job a lot easier because CBS took most of the hours and reduced my job considerably. I could concentrate more on local materials, local people. All of us were surprised and pleased at the speed with which television progressed. WMAR grew in its influence and its coverage and its acceptance among our viewers for 100 miles in every direction. And we became quite proud of what we had put on the air for the Baltimore Sun, and we hope that many people will appreciate also their favorite programs, which viewed Baltimore as it was in those days and as it still is.
Through the 1950s, as it grew into a major commercial power, TV not only reflected the American culture, it defined it. Its ascent was astounding.
When I first saw television, it was such a phenomenon, giving pictures to words. That's what you were doing. I had no idea how far it could go. I did know this. I did know that it was going to create some serious problems for other news media, because you can listen to a news show on radio, you can listen or read about the news in the newspaper, but to see it unfolding before your very eyes, although it was filmed, perhaps an hour before or yesterday or whenever, it was a phenomenon that captured the interest of people. And I got to tell you, when it first came along, I suspected, being a newspaper guy, I suspected that sooner or later that will be the source of folks getting their information.
Just 15 years after its big breakout of 1948, television established a stronghold on the very edge of global history.
The death of John Kennedy. I did the funeral from St. Matthew's, and that was for one of the first shows telecast to Europe live.
That weekend, it seems to me that television never went off, and it went from bad to worse. The whole nation is mourning Jackie Kennedy and LBJ and Mrs. Johnson all coming back, Jackie's clothing covered with blood, and they finally unload the president's body here in Bethesda. And this whole thing we are following, and then on a Sunday, I'm looking at television still, and they kill Oswald. Jack Ruby kills Oswald on television. And it seemed to have gone from frightening to devastating.
Prior to that, television's been around, for 15 years before that happened, but television was still basically an entertainment medium, local entertainment and national entertainment. But a lot of the local programming was entertainment, so it was perceived as something less serious than it became when its abilities to take you there live happened at that particular time. Technical facilities had begun to be developed that made it possible to get out and get live and get on the air. We had no tape in this building of any kind until the early 60s.
I knew then that this was it, because we had so many viewers and so much interest, and we were able to show so much, that this was it. There was no going back then.
When we come back, more from WMAR's Film Archives. A nostalgic peek at the Baltimore of 50 years ago.
Hi, everybody. This is Jim McManus. I'd like you to meet right now one of the most famous young men in baseball, despite the fact he hasn't gotten to the point of pitching his first major league game yet. This is Paul Pettit, the 18-year-old California boy to whom the Pittsburgh Pirates paid a reported $100,000 last winter to sign a contract. Remember, Paul's with the New Orleans Pelicans right now, but today, as you see, he's in Baltimore. Paul, what you doing in town here?
May 1950, on WMAR-TV Baltimore, future broadcasting legend Jim McKay, then known as Jim McManus, interviews a baseball bonus baby visiting Baltimore to see a doctor about a sore arm. Jim McManus McKay launched a long, award-winning career from behind a Channel 2 microphone. He was there at the very beginning.
When that $100,000 story broke, I guess a lot of pressure came down on you, didn't it?
We've really only touched on the first decade or so in the life of this TV station. But WMAR's first 10 years were extraordinarily busy, from building a transmitter and getting its signal into the air, from devising programming and hiring people to give the station its personality.
Along the way, Channel 2 established itself as Maryland's TV station, and it turned a camera on the community it served. Baltimoreans who tuned into the station in the late 1940s and early 1950s could see their community in a way they never had before. And so we come again irresistibly to Channel 2's rich film archives, which provides a kind of home movie of the Baltimore that used to be.
Here's the Chesapeake Bay Bridge under construction in 1950, still 2 years away from its opening. Here's May Day in Essex, and the circus arriving in Baltimore. Whether you lived through these times or have always wondered what they were like, how people looked and moved back then, we leave you with this last look at the Baltimore captured forever 50 years ago by Channel 2.
And I'm Don Kellett, president of the Baltimore Colts. A little warm to be thinking about football, but we're certainly thinking about it. And our fans are here today at 2013 North Charles Street picking up their season tickets.
I'm C.E. Jones, and I bought two season tickets, one for myself and one for my boy last December, and I stopped into the office this morning. I got exactly what I purchased.
Yes, I'm Tony, the barber, and I'm just going to buy some a ticket, and I wish we beat the Washington.
Certainly I shall not seek the support of Jack Pollock or any other political boss or would-be boss.
We have a good group of young ball players here for the opening of the instructional camp.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dave Stickle, and let's talk turkey. We're at the annual turkey auction sponsored by the Maryland State Poultry Council, the Maryland Turkey Producers Association, and the Maryland Farm Bureau, the Maryland State Fair Board, in the crowded lobby of all places, the Lord Baltimore Hotel.
This is the group of 14 youngsters who graduated this morning from the Cathedral Kindergarten at University Parkway and 39th Street. After the opening prayer, the entire school joined in singing, "I Wish I Were a Little Bird."
And now the purple dusk of twilight time steals across the meadows of my heart. High up in the sky, the little stars climb, always reminding me that we're apart. You wander down the lane and far away, leaving me a song that will not die. Love is now the stardust of yesterday, the music of the years gone by. Sometimes I